The door to the executive suite didn't close, it sealed. That was the only word for it. The heavy mahogany swung shut behind Vera Okonkwo with a kind of finality that made the air in the room feel suddenly thinner, and she stood very still for a moment, her portfolio pressed flat against her chest, waiting for her heart to catch up with the rest of her. Across the room, Matteo Salvini didn't look up. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the harbor, one hand in his trouser pocket, the other holding a phone to his ear, speaking in low Italian that Vera had long since stopped pretending she couldn't understand. 3 years working as the forensic risk analyst for Salvini Group's Montreal office had a way of teaching a person things they hadn't meant to learn. "Non adesso," he said. "Not now," and ended the call. He turned, and his eyes moved over her the way they always did. A quick, assessing sweep, the kind a man gives to a room when he's checking for exits. Then they stopped. Just for a second, just long enough for Vera to notice. She was wearing the burgundy wrap dress. She hadn't meant to wear it today. She'd meant to wear the grey blazer, and the trousers that made her look more like a structural wall than a woman. The ones her mother called her "don't talk to me" clothes. But the grey blazer had a coffee stain on the lapel that she'd discovered at 7:42 this morning, and the burgundy dress had been right there, and now here she was, and Matteo Salvini had stopped sweeping and was just looking. "You're 10 minutes early," he said. "The briefing material is more complex than usual." She moved toward the conference table without being invited to, because she had stopped waiting for invitations approximately 2 years ago. "The Lariviere acquisition has 3 separate shell structures I think you need to understand before you sign anything." He came away from the window. She heard him more than she saw him. The quiet weight of his footsteps on the hardwood, the slight exhale that meant he was shifting modes from whatever he'd been before she walked into the version of himself that paid attention. Vera Okonkwo had grown up in Brampton, in a house where her father kept 3 filing cabinets of tax records going back to 1987, and her mother could calculate a grocery bill to the cent before they reached the register. She had learned early that numbers were a language, and that people who spoke it fluently were either feared or ignored, and she had spent a significant portion of her adult life being ignored. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and built, as her aunt had once put it, with great affection, like someone designed for endurance rather than speed. She wore her hair natural and her opinions close, and she had been working for Matteo Salvini for 3 years without him, once asking her a single personal question. Until today, she was spreading the Lariviere documents across the table when she felt him behind her, not touching. He was never that careless, but close enough that she registered the change in air temperature, the faint cedar and smoke quality of whatever he wore, and she kept her eyes on the paper because she had made herself an agreement about exactly this kind of situation. "The second shell," she said, "is registered in the Cayman Islands to a numbered company that traces back to a holding group in Luxembourg. I've flagged it because 3 of the directors on that Luxembourg board are also listed as consultants to Mercer Logistics." Vera. Something in the way he said her name made her hand stop moving. She looked up. He was standing closer than she'd registered, his expression doing the thing it occasionally did, where all the professional distance evaporated, and she was left looking at something she didn't quite have a name for. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark, unhurried, the kind of eyes that had learned to give nothing away were giving something away. "Who brought you here?" he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry, to this building this morning. Who drove you?" "I took the metro. With..." He stopped. "Reset. You came through the lobby dressed like that, and you took the metro." Vera looked down at the burgundy dress, then back up at him. "I'm not sure what the dress has to do with the Lariviere acquisition." "It doesn't." He moved away, putting the length of the table between them, and she watched him do it with the awareness of someone who had learned to read exits. "Forget it. Show me the Luxembourg filing." She showed him the Luxembourg filing. She showed him all 3 shell structures, walked him through the directorship overlap. explained in precise and careful language why signing before they'd traced the beneficial ownership would be the kind of mistake that didn't stay quiet. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without performing attention. It was one of the things she had stopped herself from finding too appealing approximately 18 months ago. When she finished, he said, "How long have you known about the Mercer connection?" 4 days. Why didn't you flag it sooner? I needed to verify it through 3 separate sources before I brought it to you. I wasn't going to walk in here with a suspicion. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the windows, a cargo ship was making its slow way through the St. Lawrence, and the light coming off the water was the particular pale gold of a Montreal October, and Vera told herself to stop noticing things like that. "All right," he said. "Kill the acquisition." She gathered her documents. She was almost at the door when he spoke again. "The dinner Thursday," he said. "The Fontaine group. You're attending." She turned. "I attend all the Fontaine dinners as my analyst." He paused. "This time you'll be attending as my partner." The word landed in the room with a weight she wasn't prepared for. "Your business partner, for the purposes of the evening." His tone was completely level. "Fontaine has been trying to poach you for 8 months. I'd like them to understand that your future is here." Vera held his gaze for exactly as long as it took her to decide she wasn't going to dissect that statement in front of him. "I'll need the briefing materials for the Fontaine accounts. My assistant will send them." She left. She did not think about the way his eyes had moved over her dress, or the way her name had sounded when he said it like that for the rest of the morning. She managed until noon. The thing about working for a man like Matteo Salvini was that you learned quickly not to confuse intensity for interest. Vera had watched him dismantle a hostile bid for one of their subsidiary companies with the same quiet focus he brought to reading a menu, and she had long since filed him under the category of men who were simply built at a different temperature than other people. He was 41 years old, the second son of a Milanese family whose business history was long and not entirely legible to outsiders. He had come to Montreal 8 years ago, built the Canadian operations into something that dwarfed the original European holdings, and had cultivated precisely 0 close personal relationships in the process, as far as Vera could tell. She had 4 friends, a plant named after a CPA regulation, and a mother who called every Sunday at 11 and said things like, "Vera, you work too hard to be so alone," in a voice that meant something slightly different each time. She had a studio apartment in Verdun with a view of the canal and a coffee maker she'd had since graduate school. She had 3 degrees, 2 of which most people in her office didn't know about. She had, 3 years ago, turned down a considerably higher offer from a competing firm because the Salvini Group file was the most interesting thing she had ever seen, and she had not once regretted that decision, until the moment she walked into the Thursday dinner and understood what attending as his partner actually looked like in practice. The Fontaine Group dinner was held at a private dining room at a restaurant in Old Montreal that Vera had walked past many times and never entered, because the menu in the window did not include prices, and she had principles about that. The room was all exposed stone and candlelight, the kind of deliberately understated elegance that costs more than chandeliers, and there were 12 people seated around an oval table when Matteo arrived with Vera at his side. He introduced her as Vera Okonkwo, his chief risk strategist, not my analyst, not someone from my office, his chief risk strategist. She felt the small recalibration that moved through the room, the slight sharpening of attention, the reassessment, and she kept her face pleasant and her posture good and shook hands with people whose legal exposure she knew in some detail. Rémy Fontaine was at the head of the table. He was 60, silver-haired, the kind of man who bought things because they were beautiful and kept them for the same reason. He took Vera's hand and held it a beat longer than necessary and said, "I've been trying to get you over to our side for the better part of a year. I'm aware," Vera said pleasantly. "The offers were very generous, but not generous enough," she smiled. I find the work at Salvini more interesting. Remy laughed. Beside her, Matteo said nothing, but she felt him make some small movement, a shift of weight, a fractional turn toward her that she catalogued and set aside. The dinner was long and good and strategically complex in the way that all Fontaine group events were. Vera ate, and spoke when spoken to, and watched the room the way she always watched rooms. And twice she noticed men at the table looking at her in the particular way she had learned to recognize. The measuring look, the slight surprise that the woman next to Salvini was built like she was, that she was taking up space confidently and apparently without apology, that she was clearly not decorative. The second time it happened, Matteo noticed her noticing. He said nothing, but at some point in the evening his hand moved to the back of her chair, and it stayed there for the rest of the meal. She told herself it was staging. She was good at her job, and being good at her job meant reading situations accurately, and she was not going to misread this one just because his hand was warm, and she was wearing the burgundy dress again, and the candlelight was doing something unfair to his face. It was past 11 when the dinner ended, and they were standing on the cobblestones of the Vuurpoort in the cold October air, and Vera's coat was not quite warm enough, and Matteo was looking at her with the expression she didn't have a name for. "There's something you should know," he said. A car was waiting at the curb. His, presumably. It always was. "The Fontaine Group reached out to my legal team this week," he said. "Not to you directly this time. They made an offer to acquire your contract." Vera was quiet for a moment. "That's not how employment works." "No, it isn't. I declined on your behalf, and I acknowledge that was not my decision to make." He said it flatly, without apology but also without the arrogance she might have expected. "I wanted you to know why, because you should have the information, Matteo." She said his name and watched him react to it, the slight stilling, the attention that arrived immediately and completely. "Why did you decline?" The cold came off the river in long, slow waves. Somewhere up the street, a restaurant was still doing late business, and the sound of other people being warm together drifted toward them and dissolved. "Because you found the Mercer connection," he said. "Because you've found 11 things like the Mercer connection in 3 years, and not one of them made it to litigation. Because every senior analyst I have would have brought me that suspicion in 48 hours, and you waited 4 days and brought me certainty." He paused. "And because when I walked into my own conference room this morning, and you were standing there in that dress laying out a Luxembourg shell structure, like you were explaining how weather works, I could not think of a single reason to let Remy Fontaine anywhere near you." The cobblestones were uneven under her heels. She was very conscious of the fact that she was standing completely still. "That last part," she said carefully, "is not a business reason." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The quiet stretched between them, and Vera stood inside it, and thought about the grey blazer with the coffee stain, and thought about 3 years of treating intensity like it was just the ambient temperature of a particular kind of work, and thought about the way her name had sounded this morning. "I need you to be more specific," she said. It was the most important professional habit she had. She never moved on an implication. She needed the clause. Matteo looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I need you to have dinner with me again. Not for Fontaine, not for any client." He paused. "I need to know if you want that. I work for you, not if you find that arrangement inconvenient. I've been in contact with 2 firms who would consider you an extraordinary asset. You would not be leaving for a lesser position." He said it without flinching, which was either the most cold-blooded thing she had ever heard or the most honest, and she had not yet decided which. "I am not asking you to choose your career for me. I'm asking if there's anything here that you'd like to choose at all." She looked at him. She looked at the car at the curb, and the river beyond, and the bare October trees along the promenade. She thought about the plant named after a CPA regulation and her mother's Sunday calls, and the studio apartment in Verdun where she ate dinner alone most nights, reading case files that were interesting enough to make it acceptable. "I'm keeping my job," she said. Something moved through his expression. Not disappointment, the other thing. That wasn't a no, she said. But I'm keeping my job, and if you want to take me to dinner, you'll have to do it as the kind of man who understands the difference between what someone does and who they are. Because I have spent 3 years being the person in this organization who finds the thing no one else found, and I will not trade that for a dinner. I don't want you to trade anything. He said it quietly. Vera, I am not asking you to be less. She breathed in cold air that smelled like the river and old stone. All right, she said. Then ask me to dinner, properly. He asked her to dinner, properly. The thing about the Fontaine Group was that they did not accept a no without engineering an alternative. Vera learned this 3 weeks later, when she was sitting in the server room of the Salvini Group's downtown office at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, because the server room was the only place in the building with reliable temperature regulation, and she did her best thinking in the cold, which her colleagues found eccentric, and she found efficient. She had been cross-referencing the La Riviere files, which were officially dead, but which she had never quite stopped examining, because something about the Luxembourg board structure still didn't resolve correctly when she found it. It was not dramatic. It never was in her experience. It was a discrepancy in a filing date. 4 days. The Luxembourg board had updated its beneficial ownership register 4 days before Mercer Logistics had filed its consulting agreements, which meant someone had known the acquisition was coming before the offer was public, which meant there was a leak. She sat with this information for 40 minutes, running the timeline forward and backward, checking it against 3 separate regulatory databases. Then she picked up her phone. Matteo answered on the second ring. It was 10:22. She could hear the particular quality of silence that meant he was still in his office. I need you in the server room, she said. He came without asking why. She walked him through it. All of it. The filing dates, the ownership register, the timeline, the 3 companies she'd traced the consulting fees through, and the 4th one she hadn't been able to trace yet, because it was incorporated under a name that didn't appear in any Canadian database but did appear, once, in a Cayman Islands Incorporation record from 2019. She spoke for 17 minutes. He stood behind her left shoulder and watched the screens and did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, "The 4th company, I know. Can you find it?" Given 48 hours and access to the European Registry APIs, yes, you have them. She turned in her chair to look at him. He was in his shirt sleeves. He'd taken off the jacket somewhere between his office and the server room, which she registered as the kind of detail she collected without meaning to. And his expression was not the one he wore in meetings or in the harbor window, or in private restaurants on cobblestone streets. It was something older and more direct. Someone in this building told them, he said. Yes. That means this goes to the lawyers before it goes anywhere else. Agreed. But I want the 4th company first. She held his gaze. I want to walk into that room knowing every name on every document. I don't want to hand them a partial case and have something come back. He was quiet. Then, 48 hours, 48 hours. He reached past her and pulled up the European Registry interface on the secondary monitor, moved the keyboard within her reach, and then did not move away. She was aware of him in that immediate and inconvenient way she had been aware of him since October, and she pulled the keyboard toward her and started typing. They worked until 2 in the morning, him reading, asking questions, pulling documents she hadn't thought to pull, her following the money the way she always followed it, not dramatically, not with urgency, just with the absolute unshaking certainty that it went somewhere, and that she was going to find where. At 1:47 she found the 4th company. It was registered to a numbered corporation in Delaware. The sole director was a man named Gregory Alcott Sutherland, who was also, according to a 2021 filing she pulled from a provincial securities registry, a junior partner at the law firm that had been representing Fontaine Group for 11 years. She sat back in her chair. Behind her, Matteo said, "There it is. There it is, she agreed. She printed the filing, the ownership records, the timeline, and the consulting agreements, and organized them into a sequence a first-year lawyer could follow. Then she turned off the secondary monitor and looked at Matteo, who was looking at her with an expression she had finally, after 2 months and 3 dinners and 1 evening, on his building's rooftop, with a view of the St. Lawrence at dusk, found a name for. "You should go home," he said. "I'll call Pellerin in the morning. Call him now. This is the kind of thing that moves faster when the other side finds out you know." He pulled out his phone. He called the lawyer at 1:52 in the morning without a single apology for the hour, explained the situation in 2.5 minutes, and listened for 4. Then he hung up and said, "He's filing a preservation order at 8 a.m. Good, Vera." She was gathering her printed documents, her notebook, her coat from the back of the chair. She stopped. "I have been doing this for 16 years, he said. "I have had analysts, consultants, advisors, people I trusted completely." He paused. "No one has ever done what you just did." She looked at him. "Found the 4th company. Built the whole case at 2 in the morning so that when we walk into that room we don't hand them a partial." He said it evenly, but there was something underneath it that she heard clearly. "So that nothing comes back." She held his gaze. "I told you, I'm not going to bring you a suspicion." "I know." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Something that didn't perform itself. "That's what I mean." Outside the server room's small high window, Montreal was dark and cold and beginning to frost, and Vera Okonkwo stood in the blue light of a dozen monitors with a stack of printed evidence in her arms and understood, with the particular precision that had always been her great gift, that this moment was the kind that didn't repeat. She set the documents back down on the desk. She looked at him for a long moment. The real him, the one in shirt sleeves, at 2 in the morning, who had come without asking why and stayed without being asked. And she made a decision the way she always made decisions, which was to stop checking the data and trust the conclusion. "You should know," she said, "that I'm very good at this. I know. I mean all of it." She held his gaze. "I need you to understand what you're choosing. Vera," he said, and her name in his mouth still had that quality, the one she'd noticed the first time and catalogued and spent 3 months trying not to revisit. "I know exactly what I'm choosing." The preservation order went through at 8:15. By noon, the Fontaine Group's legal exposure was in the hands of 3 different regulatory bodies, and Gregory Alcott Sutherland had stopped answering his phone. By the following Tuesday, Raymie Fontaine's board had issued a statement, and 2 senior partners at his law firm had quietly submitted their resignations. No one called Vera's work a suspicion again. That winter, she moved into a larger apartment, still in Verdun, still with a view of the canal, because she had decided she was not the kind of person who changed her geography for a man, and she brought the plant named after a CPA regulation, and the coffee maker she'd had since graduate school. And on Sunday mornings her mother called at 11 and said, "Vera, you sound different lately," in a voice that finally meant exactly one thing. She did not correct her.